Okay, let's get this show on the road. I thank you all for joining me. And in particular, I want to welcome our guest, Jack. Jack, I'm kidding. Of course, if you've watched any of our shows involving, certain questions, but particularly questions involving salvation, like the video and the link that I provide in the description below, to a video I did on John 6:44, well, then you know we have an occasional show contributor uh, who goes by the name of Jack, but that may not necessarily be his real name. Still, we at times, of course, use different names when we're on different boards, and it's more of a character name that he goes by. So, in any case, Jack is known for highlighting or bringing to the fore questions pertaining to salvation. So, when I came across a few texts after I did the John 6:44 video, I wanted to discuss them further. And in particular, hey, Jack, I see Jack is with us, so it's no longer a hypothetical. It is now an actual. We're talking to Jack, and so that was the goal. And whether he was with us or watched it on the video, I know he thinks about these things, as most of us do. But we all have our special interests, right? And so I associate Jack with these kinds of issues, and I think he's okay with that. See, so if it bothered him or if I didn't think it was a good thing, I think he likes the discussion in a way that hopefully will help stimulate better Christian association and understanding about these issues. Because sometimes, just like with the Trinity, remember I talked about that in my Who Are the Christians video. And in one of the texts that I read in that video, we're going to read today as well. But in that video, I talked mostly about the differences between Trinitarians and others in terms of the theology having to do with the nature of God and Jesus. So in this case, there are also issues that can divide us when it comes to questions of salvation. And so, as strange as that may seem, we do at times need to discuss it because, like with the Trinity, it can be a source of confusion for some. Even though, like with the Trinity, I don't think it's a good idea for us to discuss these texts in a way that repeatedly is adversarial or covers the same issues, because then I think we're losing out on other opportunities. And the issues should speak for themselves if we've already covered them, unless we have something new. And I think that's what I have today in some sense, if not in the primary text that I want to highlight, then in the grouping that I have, which initially was John 6:44 through 47. Those are some of Jack's favorite texts. And of course, a lot of us as well. But because they come up a lot in association with Jack, that's why I say that. And they're good texts, so that's a good thing. And John 8:30 through 47. Those were the two I initially put up, but you may not have noticed because I changed the title and the thumbnail pretty much like 10 minutes ago. That's why I was a few minutes late. And so it's now John 6:44 through 47, John 8:30 through 47, and John 15:1 through 6. And the reason I added John 15 is because, we read different texts at different times. We've all read these sections of John, I'm sure. But I'm grouping them together for this specific discussion about salvation. And I just didn't initially see John 15, in such a clear association. But I was listening to my Who Are the Christians video a little bit earlier, and I heard when we were reading John 15, I realized that does fit in. And it fit perfectly. So we're not going to read the whole section that I read on that other video, 1 through 13 of John 15. Just 1 through 6, and I think we can do this quick, in terms of the reading. You know how I don't like to read a lot unless we really have to get into the text and talk about it. Because, well, it's a video. So even though reading can be helpful, like I said, in terms of Let's see what it's saying. We go through the context. If at all possible, I prefer to just discuss our shared understanding. However, in this case, I believe we do need to read these 3 sections together. So as usual, I'm going to read the NWT. And, okay, so Jack is still active in his discussions. And he brings up Calvinism. Now, in my on my Who Are the Christians video, link below in the description, someone posted a comment about how even if we were able to resolve some of our issues on things like the Trinity or Unitarian's view of Jesus or CWJs or JWs and then work together in spite of our differences, focus on Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. When someone commented and said, even if we could do that, well, you'd have people like James White who would say you're still not a Christian if you presented a different gospel. So it became more like I was talking about in relation to this salvation issue, more than just the Trinity or the nature of God or Jesus. So now my response to that would be, since I didn't get to address all the comments, but I appreciate them before we get into these texts, because they kind of relate to some of the things I think might be involved in Jack's friend's interpretation of these texts, since James White is one of the leading figures of Calvinism in terms of promoting Calvinism as the correct, gospel, right? That he says needs to be presented according to Paul in Galatians in order for us to be right. So, and he has a point there, at least in terms of, he's citing a text, right? He's citing a text that says you need to have this or basically that, or you're not. So we do need to deal with the text. I'm not saying James White or others who would use the question about what kind of gospel or what kind of Jesus we use or present as far as a measure for Christian association or acceptance. It's just that when it comes to those kinds of questions, we're not going to be able to reach every single person in every single group. So I'm not really suggesting, nor was I suggesting, although of course that would be my ultimate hope, and that is that we could all do this, work together for God's praise and glory because of Jesus as the Christ, Philippians 1:11. But I don't believe that's necessarily the most practical outlook or objective, because it's just too difficult to expect everyone, whether it's the Watchtower or whether it's in evangelical Christianity or in Mormonism, they're just not all going to be comfortable. If even a few from each group would be comfortable, but some I believe will and would if given the opportunity. And so that's what I'm presenting or was in that video. But I'm not suggesting everyone is going to potentially even see that as, okay, let's try to work toward that goal and even try. Some will probably, based on the numbers and history over these issues, not even want to try and think it's ridiculous, that you would even associate or try to work with people of well, I don't want to say different faiths, right? Because we all believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, 1 John 4:15. But we're going to get into the salvation moment. My point is, since this relates to it, since Jack's friend and other people within Christianity, I'll say, if you're a Calvinist or a non-Calvinist, it can make a huge difference. And so that's why I believe we do need to at times address these texts. Now, I've written about questions involving salvation and what the Bible teaches, but that doesn't mean that I've written about or considered everything. So I'm always open to additional information and or interpretations of texts I've read. And in reading some of these texts, although I've used them in these discussions, the ones we're going to read, I didn't quite make the connection between John 8 and John 6 that I'm going to make right now. And that I'm going to connect with John 15. Now, this may be old ground to Jack and others, because I'm just not as involved in the ongoing discussion of these texts as I am with other subjects or have been in the past. Again, it's not that I haven't. I have with Maury and others. But, and in my writings, I have a whole chapter in several of my editions done all three of them on salvation, and on the our freedom and the free will of God. So these subjects are not new to me in that way. They're just not the things I pursued as often as things like the Trinity maybe, or certain NWT translation issues. And so Jack is a good springboard for this discussion, because he knows, he's more involved with Calvinists and others, and so he can present that position as one more actively involved with people. So that's why I like to get him involved. And when I almost brought this up. I forced myself not to, Jack. I was going to almost add this as an addendum to my Who Are the Christians? But that and this fits with that. This isn't meant, even though, as we just discussed, Calvinists and others might say, you're not a Christian, or we don't accept you as a brother or sister unless you believe, this about salvation. I'm trying, this isn't my presentation of my view of these texts doesn't mean that I require Christians to interpret them the same way as I do to be considered a Christian. I believe in three things that are required for Christian association: worship of Jah, the Father, as the one God, accepting Jesus as the Son of God, the Christ whom he sent, and treating others the way you want to be treated. Now, there's a lot of other beliefs involved with that and taught in the Bible, but what we try to do, the CWJah Christian Witnesses of Jah, different from groups like Calvinists and others, we just focus on those three as far as, okay, do you accept and will you teach those things primarily and above all else, or are you gonna spend a lot of your time, and if you do, that's okay. We don't believe we're the only way or the only right group as far as, you have to come to us to do Christianity correctly. We just try to take a simple approach and focus on the things that we believe are the most important. And it does not mean that these things like salvation are unimportant. It just means we believe these things can be brought to a person in association with our three primary beliefs. So when I talk about Calvinists and others as like more involved with these discussions, it's not that we don't discuss them or care about salvation. It's just that we find ourselves, like Jack and others, talking with groups in Christianity about our differences involving things like, well, what does it mean to be saved? And so instead of working together and promoting Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, like I was talking about in my Who Are the Christians video, we end up discussing a lot of these issues. And while I believe our time is ultimately better spent, as you know, trying to reach those who don't believe, it's important for us to have an understanding of these texts as well, so that we can present, like Galatians teaches, the right great message or gospel. The great message being the teaching about Jesus and the significance of his coming and giving his life in our behalf. John 3:16, a text almost everyone has heard of or read at some point. That's where I'll leave that. So now let's get into these texts. Let's start with John 6:44. I'm going to use the NWT because I'm familiar with it. If you see a problem with it, if in any part of what I read you think there's something wrong and you want to talk about it, feel free to bring it up. And I'll be happy to discuss it to the extent that I can, or that fits with our discussion involving salvation, Calvinism, and these texts and what they teach as far as believing, and what that means. So let's start with John 6:44. I'll read 44 through 47, and then I'll check to see if anyone has any comments or questions about the translation in the New World Translation or text, and then I'll explain what I think it means. Now, when it comes to these first verses in John 6, I've already basically discussed them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with them. I'm going to use these to introduce John 8 and John 15, because John 6:44 and other texts, but John 6:44 through 47 is enough for us to caption the issue, apart from the video I did that considers more of John 6. So I highly recommend you take a look at the link below if you want to see that video and learn more about my and Jack's discussion of John 6. And so I'm going to focus in a limited sense on John 6. Look at the other video for more, or bring up an issue in the comments. Okay, John 6:44. No man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will resurrect him in the last day. Verse 45. It is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by Jehovah. I'm not going to get into issues of the divine name and whether it should or should not be used in these texts. I think most of you know my view, especially when it comes to a quotation from the Old Testament text. But that's a separate subject, okay? So let's set that aside and just talk about the issues involving belief and salvation. Right? Let's set aside the divine name and any related Trinitarian or non-Trinitarian but divine name issues and focus on salvation issues, faith issues, belief. Verse 46, not that any man has seen the Father except he who is from God. This one has seen the Father. Verse 47, the final verse of this grouping. Most truly I say to you, he that believes has everlasting life. So, now many will read this text that when he says, this is Jesus talking, the person who believes, verse 47, he that believes has everlasting life. So there are some who believe that means you now have had that life imputed to you through Christ in a way that based on your belief, it says right here that he that believes means you are saved permanently and you cannot lose that salvation. Now there's different aspects to it, and I'm not going to get into every single view. Unless you bring it up, then we'll address it. Of course, I'll do my best. But what I want to highlight is some believe that when it says in verse 47, he that believes, that is a form of the Greek verb pisteuo. I'm going to highlight a couple Greek verbs, really just two, pisteuo and meno, which means to remain or continue, abide. Verse 47, he that believes, pisteuo, form of the verb pisteuo, has everlasting life. Okay, so the question here then is, you believe, the person believes, they have everlasting life, they can't come to this point, right, unless they're drawn by the Father. It says right there in verse 44, no man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I'll resurrect him in the last day. Now, again, see my video in the link below on John 6:44 and other texts for the larger context and verse grouping. But let me just focus on this part of John 6. Again, verse 44 through 47. No man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And then he says in verse 47, he that believes has everlasting life. And these are to people who are with him, that have been drawn to him, and that have also, as the text says in verse 45, been taught by Jehovah. They're Jews. They're people who have been raised in the synagogues and learned from the texts, the very texts, the prophets that Jesus is quoting from. So that's John 6:44 through 47. These people are drawn by the Father. Now, I'm not going to get caught up into whether they, again, the larger discussion in this case. I want to focus on the fact that in verses 44 through 47, Jack, that no one can come to the Father, to Jesus, unless the Father who sent Jesus draws that person. And he says, he that believes has everlasting life. Okay, very important, as are all texts. But now let's go to John 8. Okay, let's keep John 6:44 through 47 in mind. This is really an introduction, this John 6:44 through 47. I've already talked about the larger context, and we might get into it a little bit more later. But let me just bring you through this connection. It to me is so important if it's not new ground or if it's not old ground. Again, maybe Jack and others have covered this, but I want to cover it with you if that's the case. And if not, I want to know what you think. Because here's what I'm talking about. So, verses 44 through 47, no one can come to Jesus unless the Father draws him. He that believes has everlasting life. Form of the verb pisteuo. Let's go down to John 8. John 8, 30 through 47. It's not very long, but there are several parts of this section. This is our longest text, but this is the most important text. This is, in fact, why I'm doing this video. Well, I mean, they all go together, but this section is what I was reading. And when I read it, I realized that me and Jack need to talk. And so that's when I immediately put out the live stream notice, and I had to adjust the thumbnail, and we finally got the verse grouping we have now. But, okay, so let's talk about John 8, 30 through 47. I might stop at a couple points, but read this with me, okay? I don't often read a lot on these videos because I think it's more important that we talk. But the reading here is very important. And if your text reads different in a way you think is incorrect in the New World Translation, put it down. But otherwise, I think you're going to see what I'm talking about. John 8, verse 30. And as he was speaking these things, Jesus, many put faith in him. This is our anchor verse in this section. John 8:30. As Jesus was speaking these things, many put faith in him. Again, a form of the Greek verb pisteuo. Same as in John 6:47. Verse 31, John 8. And so Jesus went on to say to the Jews, Jack, to the Jews that had believed in him. Again, a form of the Greek verb pisteuo. Here's what he says. If you remain, a form of the verb meno, in my word, you are really my disciples. These two verses, after Jesus said these things, you can read what he said, but what he said before this verse, verse 30, after he said that, many believed in him. In verse 31, Jesus addresses the Jews that had believed in him. What did John 6:47 say? Let's go back to that text, Jack. I know you could probably... Let me just bring it up here again because it's very important that we make this connection if you haven't already. And again, if you have, bear with me. I want to get your thoughts. Verse 47, most truly I say to you, he that believes has everlasting life. Form of the verb pisteuo. He that believes has everlasting life. John 8, verse 30. Let me just read. Let's go back to this again. Very important. It won't take us long because you'll see the connection. Verse 30. As he was speaking these things, many believed in him, put faith in him. Pisteuo. Verse 31. And so Jesus went on to say to the Jews that believed in him, had believed in him, this form of the verb pisteuo, if you remain in my word, form of the verb meno, you are really my disciples or followers, students. Okay, verse 32, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We've all heard that, right? Very common text. Look at what they say. These are the Jews who believed in him, right? Verse 30, as he was speaking these things, many believed in him, put faith in him. So Jesus went on to say to the Jews that had believed in him, put faith in him. Then they reply in verse 33, we are Abraham's offspring, and never have we been slaves to anybody. How is it you say you will become free? Okay, now at this point, I believe everything changed. I believe they went from what John 6:47 says right here, he that believes has everlasting life. They went from that, because we know that right here, many believed in him. Jesus went on to say to the Jews that believed in him, he's still talking, they replied to him in a way that when we read, it doesn't, to me, seem quite as combative as it really is. They're basically rejecting him. Okay, in verse 33, they're questioning and rejecting him because they're claiming their allegiance to Abraham versus allowing him to set them free. What he's telling them, that's why he says in verse 31, if you remain, men know. They already believed, pistuo, right here, both times, verse 30, 31. Then he says, okay, if you remain, you're really my disciples. You'll know the truth. Truth will set you free. But then, verse 33, we're Abraham's offspring. We've never been slaves to anybody. Well, that's not true, is it? So they rejected the fact that they needed his sacrifice because we're all slaves to sin, which is what they were sacrificing to his father for, or should have been. But that obviously was not their mindset. They were more concerned with their lineage. They're being related to Abraham versus doing the things and believing in the one that Abraham foretold and through whose line the Messiah would come, or through whose people the Messiah would come. So, according to Jah's promises in Genesis. All right, now verse 34. Jesus answered them. Remember, so in verse 33, I believe, Jack, verse 33, things change. Now, it's because of what they say. And I think you're going to see why I believe that. Okay? These are the Jews who put faith in him, that Jesus goes on to talk to as the Jews who believed in him. He says, if you remain, okay, if you remain, men know you're there. You're here. You're believing in him. Just like the text says. He says, if you remain, which is where you are, in the faith, right? Then you'll know the truth. The truth will set you free. Stay right there. Keep believing. Then they say, well, wait a minute. We're Abraham's offspring. We're not slaves to anybody. What are you talking about becoming free? So their belief in him didn't go to the point to where they needed to recognize their sin as slaves in spite of being Abraham's children. That was their problem. And that's why Jesus says in verse 34, every doer of sin is a slave of sin. It doesn't matter if you're Abraham's offspring. Verse 35, moreover, the slave does not remain in the household forever. The son remains forever. They needed to go further than their lineage from Abraham, which in this case would be equivalent to a slave subject to the Mosaic law, whereas the son and belief in him and remaining in that word will do what? Verse 32, it's highlighted still. I didn't change it yet. True, it will set you free. That's that famous saying that we all know, and that's how it applies. That we're not to look at our lineage from people like Abraham and think that's enough. We believe in that and in him in terms of what he's saying about Abraham. Oh, wait a minute. We're not slaves. We're Abraham's kids. What are you talking about? We need to be free. They didn't recognize what they needed in order to remain in the word. Verse 36, if the Son sets you free, you will actually be free. We're just going to read to verse 47, but I'm going to comment all the way down. Verse 37, I know that you are Abraham's offspring. This is Jesus talking. To whom? To the Jews who put faith in him. The Jews that had believed in him. Who in verse 33 began to question him. To whom he then responds further by explaining these things. The difference between a slave and a son in terms of who remains. Like what he says up here in terms of his word. Remain in his word, remain forever. And then he says, if the Son sets you free, you'll be free. I know you're Abraham's offspring, but you are seeking to kill me. See, he's now looking at them differently. There's no question about it in my view, Jack. Now you tell me what you think. But if you compare where we start, verse 30, right there at the top, as he was speaking these things, many put faith in him. And so Jesus went on to say to the Jews that believed or put faith in him. Same verb, pistuo. If you remain, meno. Then they question him rather than remaining and being set free. They don't even know what he's talking about by being set free. So how could they then be with the Son and remain forever? They're going to be this because they don't even know that they're enslaved yet. And yet they're practicing the law. But they think they're really better than it when it's meant to show them how low we are. That's what it was meant to do. To keep us from becoming or thinking of ourselves more than we do. When we're not reminded of the mistakes we make. Now Jesus freed us from that. And so we don't have that burden and have to continually satisfy it towards Jah like they did under the Mosaic law. All right, so we're in verse 37. You're seeking to kill me because my word makes no progress among you, right? He said right here, if you remain. Here, it didn't make progress. And this is why he goes on to tell them what he's telling them right now, because my word makes no progress among you. Verse 38, what things I have seen with my Father I speak, and you, therefore, do the things you have heard from your father. So they have changed. They're no longer doing the things that brought them to Jesus, right? What would that be? John 6:44 through 47. He says right there, the one who has heard from the Father and learned, and he quotes the text from the prophets, comes to me. That's the ones who right there, verse 30, believed. They came to him. They wouldn't even be to him. As I explained in my video in the link below, they wouldn't even be with him if they hadn't fulfilled the text in John 6, that is, heard from the Father in the course of their learning through things like the prophets about the Messiah so that they would come to him. But the question, as I go on to discuss in that separate video about John 6, is whether they remain or whether they fall off like the people, many of those same people in John 6 eventually did. Some continued, some didn't. And that's what he says right here. If you remain in my word, meno, verse 31. Now we're down here. He's clearly changed from verses 30 and 31 and the rest until they say what they do in verse 33 in the sense of rejecting what he's saying here. Remain in my word, be free. What do you mean be free? We're not slaves. What are you talking about being free? And so that's why he realizes they don't understand that every doer of a sin is a slave of sin. But they don't understand that. Now, they believed in him to the point where he was one fulfilling these texts. But when he said this, just like in John 6, when he said some other things, they stopped believing in him and or questioned him. And that's what they do here. So then he goes on to treat them totally different. So much so that he says in verse 40, you're seeking to kill me. A man that has told you the truth I heard from God. Abraham didn't do this. Okay, verse 41. We're going to go to verse 47. You do the works of your father. They said to him, we're not born from fornication. We have one Father, God. In other words, they here claim that they're not even really, even though they know they were born in a human family, they really are attributing their lineage ultimately to God. And, of course, if you compare the text, if you notice in John 8:39, they say their father is Abraham, right? So if you were going to argue with a Trinitarian, and you could say, well, then is Abraham God? Because they say they have one father, right? Pater. Well, if Abraham is their father, and they believe they have one father, is Abraham God? Just something to think about. I don't want to get off on it. Back to salvation. Okay. Jesus said to them, verse 42, if God were your father, you would love me, for from God I came forth and am here. Neither have I come on my own initiative, but that one sent me forth. Verse 43, why is it you do not know what I'm speaking? Because you cannot listen to my word. Verse 44, you are from your father the devil, and you wish to do the desires of your father. That one was a manslayer when he began. And he did not stand fast in the truth, because truth is not in him. When he speaks the lie, he speaks according to his own disposition, because he is a liar and the father of the lie. Verse 45, we're almost done. Because I, on the other hand, tell you the truth, or tell the truth, you do not believe me. Verse 46, who of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why is it you do not believe me? Jack, do not believe me. Form of the verb pisteuo. Here in the negative, verse 47, he that is from God listens to the sayings of God. And that is why you do not listen, because you are not from God. Okay, let's take a quick look here again, Jack. Verse 46, who of you convicts me of sin? If I speak the truth, why do you not believe me? So we went from verse 30 and 31, as he was speaking these things, many put faith in him. And so Jesus went on to say to the Jews that had believed him, then in verse 33, they replied to him, questioning what he's saying about the truth, remaining in his word, and the truth setting them free. They claim lineage with Abraham first, never been slaves to anybody. What do you mean by becoming free? Everything changes from there on down to verse 47 and further. But I'm not going to get into the whole text, just like with John 6. I want to consider enough so that you can see, read the rest on your own. But if you see what I see, you see them going from belief, from hearing him after he was speaking these things, right? They're there. No man can come to Jesus unless they've heard from the Father, and he brings them to him, and they've learned. They have, obviously, they're here. They know the text. They're claiming to be Abraham's children. So they're obviously not unaware of the text and the figures in their history. And so they put faith in him. And so Jesus went on to say to the Jews who believed in him, if you remain, meno, then they don't remain. Just like in John 6, right? They come to him, they've heard from the Father, they've learned. He's talking to them, he goes on to talk to them, they question him, and some leave him. But they were brought to him because of the Father drawing them and them having learned. Now, I'm gonna make a stronger connection here because I believe the use of the verb pisteuo, belief, used in all three of these texts. We'll get to John 15 in a moment. And as well as the use of the verb meno, showing that that's what's there. They're already there. It's a question of will they remain? Okay, if you remain in my word. He's talking to the Jews that heard him and believed. It's not a question of did they come to him in belief. It says they believed in him. And then it says he talks to those who believed in him after he had spoken all these things. So, and that included lifting him up and all these things. And so they were prepared to accept quite a bit at this point. But when he brought up this issue of being set free and the implications of slavery, the Jews just couldn't make that connection. And it revealed something about them that changed their condition, at least in terms of how Jesus viewed them. It says right there, he talked to those who believed him. And if they remain in his word, then they really are his disciples or students. Remain. They're there. They're believing in him. After hearing him speak these things, verse 30. Then they go through this discussion with him where they basically reject him. And he says in verse 46, why do you not believe? I believe within these texts, verse 30 through 47, they go from belief, from hearing him, listening, which is very similar to John 6. They go from being drawn by the Father to Jesus, hearing him, what he's teaching, believing in him, him accepting them as believing, and then them questioning him then questioning them because they don't understand what he's saying in a way that reveals their lack of faith in the sense that they need to have the Son remain forever, just like in the remaining sense of verse 31, remaining in the word. There's a connection, but they didn't have that level of faith. And so through this discussion, it's revealed they don't believe. They did believe, and then as he explained more to them, they no longer believed. Now I'm going to read to you our final text that I believe illustrates perfectly exactly what I'm saying. John 15, 1 through 6. It's not a long section, and then we'll consider any questions. And so John 15, 1 through 6. All right, here we go. This is Jesus talking. I am the true vine. I read this also as part of a longer section in my Who Are the Christians. You can look at that. But I'm going to apply it more specifically here to John 6 and John 8. I am the true vine, John 15, 1. And my Father is the cultivator. Okay, that means gardener, basically. So Jesus is like the thing growing in the garden, the plant, the vine. And the Father is the gardener who comes out and makes sure the vine is growing right. Verse 2, every branch in me, this is Jesus talking, not bearing fruit, he, the Father, takes away. And every one bearing fruit he cleans, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you, right? What did he say in John 8, 31? If you remain in my word. They were already clean. They heard him, verse 30, and believed. The word made them clean. They were branches on the vine. But it says right here, you can note based on the illustration, every branch not bearing fruit, right? So you can be a branch, but still not become right. And so it says in verse 2, if you don't bear fruit, if you're not a good branch, he takes you away, the Father. And everyone bearing fruit, he cleans, so you can bear more fruit. And then Jesus says, you're already clean because of the word I've spoken. Okay? Just like in John 8, now you got to remain. You're already clean. And look what he says in verse 4 of John 15. Remain. Meno. Remain in or with me, and I in you or with you, just as the branch, verse 2, cannot bear fruit unless of itself, unless it remains, meno, in the vine. In the same way, neither can you. Who's he talking to? Verse 3, you are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain. Meno, verse 4. And let's skip down to the part I didn't finish. Remain. Okay, he says, and you remain with me. Well, let's just read it again. Remain with me and I with you, just as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it remains, meno, in the vine. That's Jesus. In the same way, neither can you, unless you remain, meno, in or with me. Verse 5, we're just going to read two more verses, 5 and 6. I am the vine, you are the branches. He's talking about us. He that remains, meno, with or in me, and I with or in him, this one bears much fruit. Because apart from me, you can do nothing at all. Verse 6, our last verse. If anyone does not remain, meno, in or with me, he is cast out as a branch and is dried up. And men gather those branches up and pitch them into the fire, and they are burned. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's our last verse. So notice the illustration here. You can be in the vine. You can be clean because of the word spoken to you, just like we saw, I believe, illustrated in John 8 and John 6. But here, let's specifically try to connect it with John 8 because of the use of meno and remaining. So you can be clean. You can be a branch in the vine that is Jesus. And if we don't remain, and that is bear fruit, right? Verse 5, he that remains, meno, with me, and I with him, this one bears much fruit. Verse 6, if he doesn't remain, meno, he's cast out as a branch and dried up. So right there it says, just like in John 8 we saw, you can believe, you can be on the vine, you can be a branch, and you can be cast out if you do not remain a part of the vine and continue to bear fruit. So I believe that the connection with John 6:44 through 47 in terms of belief, right? Because it says, he that hears from the Father comes to him, or no one can come to him unless they're drawn by the Father. And then the one who believes has everlasting life, John 6:47. And so that's the same verb used in John 8:31 and 30, and also in verse 46. But in 30 and 31, in the positive, the Jews believed after listening to him. Jesus spoke to the Jews who believed after listening to him, just like John 6 said would happen if people were brought to Jesus, or would be part of the reasons they came to Jesus. They had learned, that they were drawn by the Father. And so he addresses them as people who believe. Remain in my word. Just like he says right here to his disciples, his closest followers. Remain with me. But if we don't, he says it right here, we can be cast out. That doesn't mean it's just like so easy, right? Is it easy for a branch to just fall out of a vine? No, especially not if there's a good gardener. And who does it say the gardener is? The cultivator. Jah, the Father. John 8:54, the one whom the Jews said was their God is Jesus' Father. We'll not get into other issues regarding the Trinity and related subjects. My point is that he's saying the Father is the gardener. So the Father loves all of us. He sent his only begotten Son so that if we believe, right? John 3:16, pistuo, whoever believes in him has everlasting life, just like John 6:47. And what does it say happens after some believe nonetheless, but don't remain? John 8:30 through 47. John 15:1 through 6. They're cast out. They stop believing and are addressed after they show evidence that they no longer believe as those who do not believe. John 8:46. Compare with John 8:30-31. So, it looks like it looks like Jack approves of this connection, and that's really that's the key question, because Jack is more involved, and of course we all study these things, but I want to know if I'm missing something here. We're all subject to correction, of course, and I'm more than welcome to hear what you have to say. If you have something else that you believe bears on any of these texts to the point where what I've said isn't correct, or if in any of the translation of the text that we've used there's some issues. So feel free to bring these up. If not during our live stream, then in the chat. I'll do my best to discuss legitimate questions. You don't need to write a narrative. Just, hey, you got this wrong, or whatever. If there's something that you don't think we discussed properly, I'm more than willing to further consider it. It's just, when I read John 8:30 through 47, I realized, okay, first of all, we have exactly a similar thing to John 6. We have people who are believing in him, who are brought by the Father, drawn by the Father, and who have learned, but who nonetheless eventually no longer believe in him. But it says so explicitly in John 8:30 and 31 that they heard him and believed, and he addressed those Jews who believed. So there's just a level of explicitness in the statements that I believe, together with what's said in John 6, specifically 44 and 47, but the rest of the text, as I talk about further in the link below, as well as John 15. I believe John 15, John 15, 1 through 6 and more of it, but John 1 through 6 specifically, illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. that is actually shown to us in real people in John 6 and in John 8. And that's why Jesus is addressing his own disciples, his closest followers, in John 15. Just like he addressed the Jews in John 6, who were brought to him because of the Father and because of the things that they had learned through the scriptures, the prophets, and other texts. And just like he addressed the Jews in John 8, who heard what he said about all the things being raised up, John 8, 1 through 24, and through 28 even, about him being raised up. After that, they believed in him. And he accepted them as believing and told them to remain. They just didn't. And that's why he further discussed it with his disciples in John 15 by means of an illustration, because maybe they hadn't even gotten the point yet. And as we know, they still had difficulties and issues, and they hadn't yet received the Spirit. But they were in the process of following Jesus, of learning from him. They were drawn by the Father. The question is, as is raised in John 6, John 8, and John 15, will we remain in him?